Montana Territory, 1872. The wind carried the bitter chill of approaching winter across the rolling plains where Preston Galloway stood at the edge of Willow Creek, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. At 26, he'd spent nearly half his life in the saddle, riding from Texas to Montana, taking odd jobs on ranches, and learning early that a man survived longer when he kept to himself. "No point in putting down roots when the world's determined to pull them up," he muttered to his horse, a dappled gray stallion that had been his only constant companion for 3 years. Preston adjusted his worn leather hat, squinting toward the distant lights of Silver Bend, a growing settlement nestled between the foothills and prairie. The hard truth of the frontier had shaped Preston into a solitary figure, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, face weathered but youthful beneath a light stubble, with eyes the color of faded denim that rarely revealed his thoughts. The West had taught him one lesson above all others: attachments were dangerous. Everyone he'd ever cared for had either died or left, victims of disease, violence, or the harsh demands of frontier life. "Come on, Storm," he said, swinging into the saddle. "Let's see if Silver Bend has work before winter sets in." Preston had a plan: work through winter, save his earnings, then head further west come spring. Keep moving, stay ahead of memories, avoid connections that only led to pain. That was survival, that was wisdom. At least, that's what he told himself on cold nights when loneliness crept too close for comfort. Silver Bend appeared modest but thriving as Preston rode down its main street. A 2-story hotel stood alongside a general store, Assier's office, and several saloons. The town bustled with miners, farmers bringing in harvest, and ranchers preparing for winter. Preston noted the lumber mill at the edge of town, a sign of permanence and growth that made him uneasy. People here were building something to last. The Silver Dollar Saloon caught his eye, its windows glowing with lamplight. Preston dismounted, secured Storm to the hitching post, and stepped inside, immediately assessing the room with the careful eye of a man who'd learned vigilance young. Card games occupied several tables, the bar was busy with ranch hands, and a piano played in the corner. "What'll it be?" asked the barkeep, a broad man with a waxed mustache. "Whiskey." "And information, if you're selling that too." The man chuckled, pouring amber liquid into a glass. "Information's free. What kind you looking for?" "Work, preferably with room and board through winter." "You might try the Horizon Ranch. Hank Hamilton's looking for experienced hands. Lost 2 men to gold fever last month." Preston nodded his thanks, downing the whiskey in one swallow. As he set the glass down, a commotion erupted at the far end of the bar. "You can't be serious," a woman's voice, clear and surprisingly authoritative, rose above the ambient noise. 20% of the value is highway robbery, Mr. Pearson." Preston turned, curiosity getting the better of him. Standing at the bar was a young woman with honey blonde hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, wisps escaping to frame a face that stopped Preston's thoughts mid-stride. She wore a practical riding dress of deep blue, dusty from travel but well-made. She couldn't have been more than 23, yet she faced down a portly, well-dressed man with the confidence of someone accustomed to speaking her mind. "Miss Harrington, I'm simply following market rates," the man replied condescendingly. "A woman selling cattle without a husband or father to negotiate is unusual business. The risk justifies my commission." "The risk is the same regardless of who's selling. My father taught me cattle before he passed, and I've managed the ranch alone for a year. I won't be cheated because I wear skirts instead of trousers." Several men nearby chuckled, but Preston noticed how the woman, Miss Harrington, maintained her composure, chin lifted slightly, eyes steady. "Perhaps you'd prefer to drive your herd to Helena yourself," Pearson suggested with a smirk. "Perhaps I would," she replied, gathering her gloves from the bar. "Good day, Mr. Pearson." As she turned to leave, her eyes briefly met Preston's. Something in that fleeting glance, determination mingled with exhaustion, resonated with him unexpectedly. He looked away quickly, reminding himself that other people's troubles weren't his concern. Getting involved only complicated life. Preston finished his drink and was heading for the door when he overheard 2 men at a nearby table. "Poor Violet Harrington," one said, shaking his head. "Girl's in over her head. Her pa dies, leaves her that spread, and now she's trying to run it herself." "Stubborn as a mule," his companion agreed. "Turned down 3 marriage proposals already. Says she promised her father she'd keep the ranch going. Won't make it through winter without help. That north pasture fence came down in the storm last week." Cattle'll scatter first heavy snow. Preston hesitated at the door, his hand on the latch. It wasn't his problem. He had his own concerns, finding work, saving money, moving on. Yet something about the woman's determined face lingered in his mind. Before he could reconsider, he found himself approaching the table. "Pardon me," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "This Horizon Ranch you mentioned, where might I find it?" The older man squinted up at him. "Hamilton's Place, about 8 miles east, follow the creek." "No," Preston clarified, "the Harrington spread. Raven Creek Ranch. 5 miles northwest, past the ridge, but if you're looking for work, Hamilton pays better." Preston nodded, already turning away. "Much obliged." Outside, he untied Storm and swung into the saddle, pausing to stare in the direction of the Harrington Ranch. The sensible thing would be to ride east to the Horizon Ranch. Steady work, good pay, no complications. "What do you think, Storm?" he asked quietly. "Northwest or east?" The horse snorted, pawing at the ground. "Yeah," Preston sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." He turned Storm northwest, telling himself he was merely exploring options. But deep down, Preston knew the truth. Something about Violet Harrington's situation had struck a chord. Perhaps it was recognition of a kindred stubborn spirit, fighting alone against the odds. Or perhaps it was simply that, for the first time in years, someone else's struggle had pierced the careful armor he'd built around himself. Either way, as Preston rode toward Raven Creek Ranch in the gathering dusk, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was riding towards something that would challenge everything he'd come to believe about survival on the frontier. Violet Harrington stood on her porch at dawn, watching the first light break over the mountains. At 23, she had the tired eyes of someone twice her age, though her face remained youthful, with high cheekbones and a determined set to her jaw. She brushed back a strand of honey-blonde hair that had escaped her practical braid and pulled her father's old coat tighter around her shoulders. The Raven Creek Ranch stretched before her, a modest house, barn, corral, and bunkhouse, with pastures extending to the foothills. It wasn't the largest spread in the territory, but it had been her home for all her life, and it was all she had left of her parents. Her mother had died of fever when Violet was 12, and her father's heart had given out during last year's brutal winter. "I promised Pa," she whispered, a morning ritual she couldn't seem to abandon. "I'll keep it going." But promises were easier made than kept. The cattle needed to be moved to winter pasture soon. The north fence required mending. The roof leaked in 3 places. And now Pearson, the only cattle buyer in Silver Bend, was trying to cheat her because she was a woman alone. Her foreman, Old Joe, emerged from the bunkhouse, followed by the only other remaining hand, young Billy Tucker. "Morning, Miss Violet," Joe called, limping across the yard. At 65, with a leg injured in the war, Joe was loyal but limited in what he could manage. "Thought we'd start on that roof today." "The north fence is more urgent," Violet replied. "Billy, you'll help Joe. I'll see to the horses and then ride out to check the herd." She saw the concerned look pass between the men but ignored it. They'd been telling her for months she needed to hire more help, or better yet, find a husband to take over. As if she would hand over her father's legacy to some man who'd see her only as a means to acquire property. After a quick breakfast, Violet changed into her riding clothes, divided skirts that had scandalized Silver Bend when she'd first worn them, and headed to the barn. She was saddling her mare when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Hand moving to the rifle mounted by the barn door, she stepped outside to see a rider approaching at a steady pace. The morning sun silhouetted him against the eastern sky, tall in the saddle on a fine-looking gray, with broad shoulders and the easy posture of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. Violet didn't lower her hand from the rifle. Strangers often meant trouble for a woman running a ranch alone. The rider stopped a respectful distance away, raising his hand in greeting. "Miss Harrington, Preston Galloway. I heard in town you might be looking for hands." Violet studied him carefully. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps mid-20s, with light brown hair and eyes that reminded her of clear creek water. His face was relatively unweathered for a cowhand, with only a light stubble along his jaw. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and he sat his horse with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his business. "Did Pearson send you?" she asked suspiciously. The man, Preston, looked genuinely confused. "The cattle buyer? No, ma'am. I overheard your conversation with him yesterday. Seemed to me you could use an extra hand, and I need work for the winter." "I can't pay much," Violet said bluntly. Room in the bunkhouse, meals and wages when I sell the cattle. That's fair, he nodded. I'm good with cattle, horses, and repairs, can handle a gun if needed. Violet hesitated. She desperately needed help, but experience had taught her to be wary. Yet something about Preston Galloway's straightforward manner reassured her. His eyes held no guile, and he looked her directly in the face when speaking, treating her with the respect one might give a male rancher. Where are you from, Mr. Galloway? Originally Texas, been working my way north these past few years. Why? A shadow crossed his face, change of scenery. Violet recognized evasion when she heard it, but everyone on the frontier had parts of their past they preferred not to discuss. She had no right to pry if he could do the work. We're short-handed, she admitted. North fence needs mending before snow. Cattle need moving to the winter pasture, roof lakes. I can start with the fence, he offered. If that suits. Violet nodded, decision made. You can put your horse in the corral, tools are in the barn. Old Joe can show you where we keep supplies. As if summoned, Joe emerged from behind the barn, eyeing the newcomer suspiciously. Joe, this is Preston Galloway. He's hiring on for winter. Mr. Galloway, this is Joseph Miller, my foreman. The men exchanged nods. Galloway, Joe said, measuring the younger man. You know cattle. Yes, sir. Worked ranches since I was 14. Joe grunted, apparently satisfied. Miss Violet, Billy and I were just heading out to that fence. We can take the new hand along, show him the property. Good, Violet agreed. I'll check the herd and be back by noon. She turned to Preston. If you're still here at supper, we'll discuss terms more formally. Something like amusement flickered in his eyes. I expect I will be, Miss Harrington. As Violet rode out, she couldn't help glancing back at the tall stranger now following Joe toward the barn. Hiring a new hand was sensible, necessary even. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that bringing Preston Galloway onto Raven Creek Ranch might change more than just their workload. Preston found himself enjoying the work more than he'd expected. Old Joe was gruff but knowledgeable, and young Billy, who couldn't be more than 16, was eager to learn. By midday, they'd repaired nearly a quarter of the damaged fence line. Miss Violet's pa built most of this ranch himself, Joe explained as they worked. Good man, taught her everything he knew about ranching, same as he would have taught a son. Not many men would do that, Preston observed, hammering a post into place. Jacob Harrington wasn't most men, loved that girl something fierce after her mother passed, said a woman should be able to stand on her own 2 feet in this country. Joe's weathered face creased in a frown. Course, he didn't figure on leaving her alone so young, meant to see her settled proper. She seems capable enough, Preston said, remembering the determined set of Violet's jaw when confronting Pearson. Capable, yes. Stubborn as the day is long, but running a ranch isn't just about knowing how, it's about other folks letting you do it. Joe sighed, leaning on his shovel. Pearson's not the only one giving her trouble, banks making noise about her loan. Neighbors thinking her land would look good added to theirs. Town folk whispering it ain't proper for a woman alone. Preston absorbed this information silently. He'd seen it before, the frontier claimed to reward grit and independence, but that welcome rarely extended to women who stepped outside traditional roles. Why'd she turn down those marriage proposals? He asked, remembering the conversation he'd overheard in the saloon. Joe chuckled. You heard about those, did you? Well, first fellow was old enough to be her grandfather, just wanted the land. Second was a banker's son who never worked a day in his life. Third was Pearson's nephew. He shook his head. Miss Violet says if she marries, it'll be to a man who respects her ranch and her right to have a say in running it. Good luck finding that around these parts. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of labor familiar and almost comforting to Preston. Despite his intentions to remain detached, he found himself impressed by what little he'd seen of Raven Creek Ranch. The place was well planned, with good water access and sheltered pastures. It spoke of careful stewardship and intelligent management. Around noon, they spotted Violet riding back toward them, her figure straight and confident in the saddle. Preston found his eyes lingering on her longer than he'd intended. There was something compelling about the way she carried herself, dignity combined with a practical competence he rarely saw in women or men. Fence is coming along well, she observed, dismounting to inspect their work. The herd looks good, though I spotted tracks near the west pasture. Might be wolves. We'll keep an eye out, Joe promised. Young Tucker here brought lunch from the house. They sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, eating bread, cheese, and cold venison that Billy had packed. Preston noticed how Violet ate sparingly, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her mind clearly occupied with ranch concerns. "Where will you move the herd for winter?" he asked, breaking the silence. She looked at him with mild surprise, as if she hadn't expected his interest. "South pasture, it's sheltered by the ridge, catches less snow. The creek rarely freezes there." "Smart," he nodded. "When were you planning to move them?" "End of the week, weather permitting." She studied him. "You've worked cattle drives before." "Yes, ma'am, Texas to Kansas, mostly. Some local movement on ranches in Wyoming and Colorado." "Good, we'll need everyone for that." She stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "I should get back. There are accounts to review before I head to town tomorrow." "Town?" Joe frowned. "What business you got there?" "I'm going to see if Jenkins at the bank will extend our loan," she said with forced lightness. "And I need supplies." The old foreman and Billy exchanged worried glances. "Miss Violet, perhaps I should ride along," Joe suggested. "Jenkins can be difficult." "I can handle Jenkins," she replied firmly. "You're needed here with the fence." Her tone brooked no argument, though Preston noted the tension in her shoulders. After she rode away, the three men returned to work, but the mood had shifted. Joe seemed preoccupied, sighing occasionally as he wrestled with fence posts. "Bank giving her trouble?" Preston finally asked. Joe glanced at him, seeming to weigh how much to share with a new hire. "Her pa took a loan last spring for breeding stock. Payments were meant to come from this year's cattle sale, with prices down and Pearson trying to cheat her." He shrugged. "Jenkins has been making noise about calling in the note early." "Can she make the payment?" "Not without selling the cattle at a fair price, and not with Pearson being the only buyer for 50 miles. Joe hammered a post with unnecessary force. "Man knows she's desperate. That's why he offered her 20% below market yesterday." Preston worked steadily, considering this information. He'd seen similar situations play out across the West, banks and businessmen conspiring to separate hardworking people from their land. Usually he kept writing, reminding himself that other folks' troubles weren't his concern. But as the afternoon wore on, he found himself watching the ranch house where Violet had disappeared, thinking of her facing the banker alone tomorrow. Something about her determination in the face of impossible odds struck him as both admirable and painfully familiar. By sunset, they'd completed nearly half the fence line. Preston's muscles ached pleasantly from honest work as they rode back toward the ranch buildings. The evening light bathed the valley in gold, and for a moment he allowed himself to appreciate the beauty of Raven Creek Ranch, the way the buildings nestled against the hillside, smoke curling from the chimney, horses moving in the corral. It was the kind of place a man might want to call home if he were the type to put down roots. Preston quickly banished the thought. He was here for winter work, nothing more. Come spring, he'd collect his wages and move on just as he always did. Getting attached to places or people only led to pain when the time came to leave, and in Preston's experience, that time always came. Still, as he followed Joe and Billy toward the bunkhouse, he couldn't help glancing toward the main house, where a lamp burned in the window and the silhouette of a slender woman moved about inside. Just winter work, he reminded himself firmly, nothing more. Violet sat at her father's desk, staring at the account books with growing despair. The figures hadn't changed since yesterday or the day before. Without selling the cattle at a fair price, she couldn't make the loan payment due at the end of the month. Without the loan payment, she risked losing everything her father had built. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, hastily wiping away the moisture that had gathered in her eyes. Old Joe entered, followed by Billy and the new hand, Preston. "Supper's ready, Miss Violet," Joe announced. Mrs. Turner left stew before heading home. Mrs. Turner, a widow from town, came 3 times a week to cook and help with household chores. It was another expense Violet could barely afford but necessary if she was to manage the ranch business. "Thank you, Joe, I'll be right there." She closed the ledger and stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that weren't quite steady. They ate in the kitchen, the 4 of them around the scarred oak table that had been in the house since before Violet was born. She noticed that Preston waited for her to sit first, a small courtesy that few bothered with on the frontier. His manners suggested an upbringing better than most drifters. "The fence is coming along well," Joe reported as they ate. Should finish tomorrow if weather holds. Good, Violet nodded. Then we can focus on moving the herd by week's end. She turned to Preston. Mr. Galloway, are you still amenable to the terms I mentioned? Room, board, and wages when the cattle sell. Yes, ma'am, he replied, though I've been thinking about your situation with Pearson. Violet stiffened. My situation. The cattle buyer, Preston clarified, meeting her gaze directly. Joe mentioned he's offering 20% below market because he knows you have few options. That's right, she acknowledged, wondering where this was leading. Have you considered driving the herd to Helena yourself? The railroad there would give you access to better markets. Joe nearly choked on his stew. Helena's over 100 miles from here. A week's drive with good weather, Preston said calmly. Prices there would more than make up for the effort. Violet studied him, intrigued despite herself. I considered it, but with only 3 of us, it seemed impossible. 4 now, Preston corrected. I've done longer drives with fewer men. It's dangerous country between here and Helena, Joe protested. Indians, outlaws, rough terrain. All true, Preston agreed. But so is losing the ranch to a banker and a dishonest cattle buyer. The table fell silent as they all absorbed his words. Violet felt a strange mixture of hope and suspicion. Why would this stranger care about her predicament? Why suggest this? She finally asked. You've been here less than a day. Something flickered across Preston's face, discomfort perhaps at being questioned. I don't like seeing folks taken advantage of, he said simply. Especially when there's another way. Violet considered his proposal. A cattle drive to Helena was risky, but Pearson's offer meant certain failure. The bank wouldn't wait. If we did this, she said slowly, we'd need supplies. Another horse for Billy, ammunition. All things you could purchase with a fair price for your cattle, Preston pointed out. We'd have to leave day after tomorrow to beat the weather, Joe mused, warming to the idea despite his initial objection. Young Tucker would need to stay behind to watch the ranch. I can ride, Billy protested. Someone needs to tend the horses and feed the chickens, Violet told him gently. It's an important responsibility. The boy subsided, though his disappointment was evident. So, Preston said, looking at Violet, Helena. She took a deep breath, weighing the risks against the desperate reality of her situation. Helena, she agreed, if we can prepare in time. As the men discussed logistics, Violet found herself watching Preston. He spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his business, offering practical suggestions without trying to take control of the decision-making. It was refreshing. Most men either dismissed her abilities entirely or attempted to override her authority. After supper, Joe and Billy returned to the bunkhouse, but Preston lingered, helping Violet clear the table despite her protests. You don't need to do that, Mr. Galloway. Preston, please, he said, carrying plates to the wash basin, and it's no trouble. My mother would haunt me if I left a lady to clean up alone. Violet smiled despite herself. Your mother taught you well. She tried, he said, a shadow crossing his face. Though I expect she'd say I've forgotten most of my raising these past years. How long have you been on your own? Since I was 18, he replied, his tone closing the subject. Violet respected his privacy, focusing on washing the dishes he handed her. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes. Thank you, she said finally, for the suggestion about Helena. Most men wouldn't bother helping a woman they just met. Preston seemed uncomfortable with her gratitude. It's just good business sense, he said with a shrug, and I'll benefit too if your cattle fetch a fair price. Still, she persisted, it's more than Pearson or Jenkins would have done. He handed her the last plate, their fingers brushing momentarily. Not all men are like Pearson, he said quietly. Their eyes met, and for a moment Violet felt an unexpected connection, as if they recognized something in each other. Then Preston stepped back, breaking the spell. I should let you rest, he said, moving toward the door. Tomorrow will be busy if we're preparing for a drive. Yes, Violet agreed, suddenly aware of how tired she was. Good night, Preston. Good night, Miss Harrington. Violet, she corrected. If we're driving cattle together, you might as well use my name. A smile touched his lips, transforming his serious face. Good night then, Violet. After he left, Violet stood alone in the kitchen, feeling oddly unsettled. Preston Galloway was a puzzle, a drifter who spoke with education, a hired hand who offered strategy, a man who kept his distance while extending help. As she prepared for bed, Violet told herself that her interest was merely practical. Preston represented a possible solution to her immediate problems, nothing more. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, it was his smile she remembered, brief but genuine, lighting eyes that seemed to carry their own share of frontier sorrows. The next morning dawned clear but cold, with the promise of winter in the air. Preston rose before the others, eager to finish the fence work quickly so they could prepare for the drive. He found Violet already in the barn, checking tack and supplies. "You're up early," he observed, reaching for a saddle. "Lots to do," she replied, not looking up from the bridle she was mending. "I need to ride to town for supplies while you and Joe finish the fence." "Alone?" The question slipped out before Preston could stop himself. Now she did look up, one eyebrow raised. "I've been riding to town alone since I was 12, Mr. Galloway." "Preston," he corrected automatically, "and I meant no offense. It's just Joe mentioned the banker might be difficult." Violet's expression softened slightly. "Jenkins will be difficult regardless of who accompanies me, but I appreciate your concern." She returned to her work, adding, "I'll be fine. I've handled worse than Frank Jenkins." Something in her tone made Preston wonder what worse she had faced, but he knew better than to pry. Everyone on the frontier carried their burdens silently. After a quick breakfast, they parted ways, Violet riding towards Silver Bend while Preston joined Joe and Billy at the fence line. The work went quickly with 3 pairs of hands, and by early afternoon, they had completed the repairs. "Good timing," Joe observed, looking at the sky where clouds were gathering in the west. "Weather's changing, might snow by tomorrow night." "More reason to get moving to Helena soon," Preston agreed. "Let's head back and start preparing for the drive." As they rode toward the ranch, Joe studied Preston with open curiosity. "You ain't like most drifters we get through here," he observed. "Most wouldn't care whether Miss Violet got a fair price or not, long as they got their wages." Preston kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Maybe I just want to ensure I get paid." Joe chuckled, "Maybe. Or maybe you got your own reasons for helping a stubborn woman keep her ranch." When Preston didn't respond, the older man added quietly, "She's special, our Miss Violet. Got more courage than most men I know." "I've noticed," Preston admitted. They spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing for the cattle drive, checking supplies, preparing food that would travel well, ensuring weapons were clean and ready. Preston was impressed by the efficient organization of the ranch. Despite limited resources, everything was well maintained and thoughtfully arranged. It spoke volumes about Violet's management. Late afternoon brought the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Preston emerged from the barn to see Violet returning, her expression tight. She dismounted stiffly, leading her mare toward him. "Problems in town?" he asked, taking the horse's reins. "Jenkins refused to extend the loan," she said flatly. "Says if I can't make the payment by month's end, he'll begin foreclosure proceedings." Her voice remained steady, but Preston could see the strain in her eyes. "I purchased the supplies we'll need for the drive. It took nearly the last of our cash." Preston wanted to offer reassurance but knew that empty promises wouldn't help. Instead, he said simply, "Then we'd better get a good price in Helena." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Yes, we had better." She handed him a package. "New socks and gloves for the trail. The nights will be cold." The gesture surprised him. "You didn't need to do that." "Can't have my hands getting frostbite before we reach Helena," she replied practically, but there was a warmth in her eyes that stirred something unexpected in Preston's chest. "Thank you," he said, suddenly awkward. They stood for a moment in silence, the air between them charged with something Preston couldn't name. Then Joe called from the corral, breaking the moment. "Miss Violet, come see what young Billy's rigged up for the chuck wagon." As she walked away, Preston found himself watching her, the determined set of her shoulders, the grace with which she moved despite her evident exhaustion. She was unlike any woman he'd encountered in his years of drifting. Most frontier women were either hardened beyond recognition by the difficulties of pioneer life or desperately trying to maintain Eastern refinements ill-suited to the West. Violet was neither. She faced the harshness of ranch life with practical determination while retaining a fundamental gentleness. She was strong without being hard, feminine without being fragile. And that, Preston realized with sudden clarity, made her dangerous to a man who'd sworn off attachments. Because for the first time in years, he found himself wanting to know more about someone, wanting to earn the trust he occasionally glimpsed in her eyes. That night they gathered in the main house for a final planning session. The route was plotted, duties assigned, contingencies discussed. They would leave at first light, driving 60 head of cattle north toward Helena, following the old trader's route through the foothills. 6 to 7 days if the weather holds, Preston estimated, studying the crude map Joe had drawn. We'll need to average about 15 miles a day. The creek crossing near Blackwater Ridge could be tricky this time of year, Joe warned. Might be running high with the early snow melt. We'll assess it when we get there, Violet said. If necessary, we'll find another crossing. As the evening progressed, Preston found himself increasingly impressed by her knowledge. Violet understood cattle, terrain, and the practical realities of the trail as well as any rancher he'd worked for. Yet there was an underlying tension to her manner, a quiet desperation she couldn't quite conceal. When Joe and Billy retired to the bunkhouse to prepare for their early departure, Preston lingered, sensing Violet had more on her mind than she'd shared. "There's something else bothering you," he observed, helping her roll up the map, "besides the bank." She glanced up, surprised by his perception. For a moment he thought she might dismiss his observation, then her shoulders slumped slightly. "Pearson was in the general store," she admitted. "He made it quite clear that if I try to bypass him by driving to Helena, he'll ensure no one in the territory will do business with Raven Creek Ranch again." She shook her head. "He has connections with most of the merchants and other ranchers. He could make things very difficult." "Men like Pearson rule through fear," Preston said quietly. "Once someone stands up to them successfully, others follow." "And if we don't succeed?" Violet asked, meeting his eyes directly. "If something goes wrong on the trail, or the buyers in Helena aren't offering fair prices?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Preston knew he should maintain his distance, offer only practical advice. Yet something about her vulnerability in that moment, the rare glimpse beneath her capable exterior, moved him to honesty. "Then we'll face that together," he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "One step at a time." Violet studied him as if searching for something in his expression. Whatever she saw seemed to reassure her, for she nodded slowly. "Together," she repeated softly. "I haven't had much of that since my father died." The simple admission revealed more than lengthy explanations could have. Preston understood isolation, the weight of carrying burdens alone. Without thinking, he reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. "Get some rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow will come early enough." As he walked to the bunkhouse through the cold night air, Preston tried to make sense of his own actions. He'd come to Raven Creek Ranch for temporary work, nothing more. Yet here he was, initiating a cattle drive to Helena and making promises about facing challenges together. What troubled him most was that he'd meant every word. In less than 2 days, Violet Harrington had somehow breached the careful walls he'd built around himself. Her determination, her vulnerability, her sheer grit in the face of overwhelming odds, all of it called to something in him he'd thought long buried. Preston stopped, gazing up at the stars scattered across the Montana sky. He was getting in too deep, caring too much. Experience had taught him the pain that came from such connections. "Just get her cattle to Helena," he muttered to himself. "Get paid, move on, that's the plan." But as he entered the bunkhouse to prepare for tomorrow's journey, Preston couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed solitude was already beginning to crumble. The cattle drive began at dawn, with the first pink streaks of light barely visible over the eastern mountains. Violet rode point, leading the way, while Preston and Joe flanked the herd. Billy stood at the ranch gate, his disappointment at being left behind evident despite his attempts to appear grown-up. "Watch the place well," Violet told him, leaning down from her saddle to squeeze his shoulder. "We're counting on you." "Yes, ma'am," he replied solemnly. "I'll keep everything right as rain." The first day passed without incident as they moved the cattle north along the valley floor. Violet set a steady pace, neither rushing the herd nor allowing them to dawdle and graze. Preston, riding the western flank, found himself repeatedly impressed by her skill with cattle and horses. By evening they made camp in a sheltered hollow, the cattle settling easily after their day's travel. Joe prepared a simple meal over the campfire while Preston secured the horses. 15 miles, I reckon, Joe announced with satisfaction as they ate beans and bacon. Good first day. Weather's holding too, Preston observed, though he noted the clouds gathering on the horizon, for now at least. Violet sat across the fire, the flames illuminating her face as she studied a small notebook. She'd been quiet most of the day, focused on the trail ahead. What's that you're reading? Joe asked, nodding toward the book. My father's trail notes, she replied, closing it carefully. He made this journey 3 times. I'm checking his observations against our route. Smart, Preston commented. What does he say about tomorrow's terrain? The canyon narrows about 10 miles ahead. We'll need to keep the herd tight there, or we risk losing stragglers in the brush. They discussed the next day's journey while finishing their meal, the conversation easy and practical. When they'd finished eating, Joe took first watch, leaving Preston and Violet by the fire. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, the crackling flames and occasional lowing of cattle the only sounds. Preston found himself studying Violet when she wasn't looking, the way the firelight caught in her honey-blonde hair, the determined set of her jaw, the capable hands that had spent the day guiding her horse with expert precision. You handle cattle well, he said finally, breaking the silence, better than most men I've worked with. She looked up, surprise and pleasure flickering across her face at the compliment. My father believed a rancher should know every aspect of the business, regardless of whether they're male or female. A smile touched her lips. He put me on a horse before I could walk and had me helping with calving by the time I was 10. He sounds like a remarkable man. He was, she agreed, her voice softening with memory. Everyone told him he needed a son to inherit the ranch, but he just laughed and said he already had the best rancher in the territory. The smile faded from her face. I can't let him down. I can't lose Raven Creek. The naked vulnerability in her voice stirred something protective in Preston. We'll get your cattle to Helena, he promised, and they'll fetch a fair price. She studied him across the fire. Why are you helping me, Preston, really? The direct question caught him off guard. He could have offered a practical answer, the promise of wages, the challenge of the drive, but something about the moment, the isolation of the trail, demanded honesty. I know what it's like to lose something that matters, he said quietly, to have others try to take what's rightfully yours. Your family's land, she guessed. Preston stared into the flames, memories he usually kept firmly buried rising to the surface. After the war, there wasn't much left of our ranch in Texas. My father never came home from Shiloh. My mother and I tried to keep things going, but taxes were high, and carpetbaggers were offering pennies on the dollar. What happened? Violet asked softly. She took sick that winter. By spring, she was gone. He poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise into the night sky. I was 18, alone, with no way to pay the taxes. A banker in town, a man who'd eaten at our table, who'd called my father friend, foreclosed and sold our land to his brother-in-law for half its value. I'm sorry, Violet said, and the simple sincerity in her voice eased something tight in Preston's chest. It was a long time ago, he said, attempting to dismiss the memories, but when I heard about your situation with Pearson and the banker, well, I suppose some injustices still get under my skin. So you've been drifting since then? For 8 years. Preston nodded, seemed easier than putting down roots somewhere new. The frontier's no place for attachments anyway. Everything's temporary out here, towns, jobs, people. I don't believe that, Violet said with quiet certainty. My parents built something that lasted. Something worth fighting for. Maybe they were the exception, Preston suggested, or maybe you've just been looking at the frontier through the wrong eyes. She met his gaze steadily. Yes, there's hardship and loss. But there's also community, growth, futures being built. My father used to say the West isn't just about what we take from it, but what we give back, the legacy we create. Her words unsettled him, challenging beliefs he'd held for years. Before he could respond, Joe returned to the fire. All quiet, the foreman reported. Who's taking second watch? I will, Preston offered, grateful for the interruption. You both get some rest. As he moved away from the fire to begin his patrol around the herd, Preston glanced back to see Violet rolling out her bedroll, her movements efficient even in exhaustion. Their conversation lingered in his mind, her certainty contrasting sharply with his carefully cultivated detachment. What would it be like, he wondered, to believe as she did? To see the frontier not as a place of transient connections and inevitable losses, but as ground where something permanent could take root. The question followed him through his watch, persistent as the North Star overhead. For the first time in years, Preston found himself considering a different path than the one he'd followed since leaving Texas. A path where connections weren't dangers to be avoided, but foundations to be built upon. It was a dangerous line of thinking for a man who'd sworn off attachments. Yet as the night deepened around him, Preston couldn't banish the image of Violet's face in the firelight, or the conviction in her voice when she spoke of legacies worth fighting for. The second day of the drive brought the challenges Violet had anticipated. The canyon narrowed, with brush-choked draws offering tempting diversions for the cattle. They worked hard to keep the herd together, Preston and Joe repeatedly cutting off strays that attempted to wander. By midday, dark clouds had gathered overhead, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Violet felt the first raindrops as they pushed through the narrowest part of the canyon. "Weather's turning," Joe called from across the herd. "Might need to find shelter soon." Violet consulted her father's notes. "There's a wide valley opening up about 3 miles ahead. We can make camp there if needed." They pressed on as the rain intensified, soaking through their coats and making the ground treacherous. The cattle grew restless, sensing the handler's anxiety. Preston rode up beside Violet, water streaming from his hat brim. "This is getting bad," he observed. "How much further to that valley?" "Just over the next rise," she replied, squinting through the downpour. "But I'm worried about the descent. It could be slippery." He nodded grimly. "I'll ride ahead, check the trail. You and Joe keep the herd steady." Before she could protest, he urged his horse forward, disappearing into the rain. Violet felt a flicker of concern, then focused on the task at hand. The cattle were bunching nervously as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Easy," she called, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Steady now." Joe appeared beside her, his weathered face creased with worry. "Don't like this," he shouted. "Storm's getting worse." As if to emphasize his point, lightning flashed overhead, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The cattle reacted instantly, the leaders breaking into a run. "They're spooked," Violet cried, spurring her horse forward. "Head them off." The next minutes were chaos as she and Joe fought to prevent a full stampede. The herd surged forward, slipping on the muddy ground, threatening to scatter in the narrow confines of the canyon. Violet rode hard, cutting in front of the lead steers, trying to turn them. Through the rain, she caught sight of Preston racing back toward them, his face grim. He joined the effort immediately, working with practiced skill to help contain the frightened animals. Gradually, they managed to slow the herd's momentum, turning them into the wind and rain where they finally stopped, huddling together against the storm. "Valley ahead is flooded," Preston reported, pulling his horse alongside Violet's. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and mud streaked his face. "Creek's overrun its banks. We need another route." Violet consulted her mental map of the territory, considering alternatives. "There's a ridge to the east," she said finally. "It's steep, but there's a plateau at the top that should offer some protection." "Better than staying here," Joe agreed, looking nervously at the rising water around their horses' hooves. With the herd somewhat calmed, they began the difficult task of moving the cattle up the slippery slope toward the ridge. Progress was painfully slow. Several times, animals lost their footing, requiring quick action to prevent them from sliding back down the incline. Violet's mare was struggling with the terrain, the poor visibility making each step treacherous. As they neared the ridge top, the horse suddenly stumbled, throwing Violet forward against the saddle horn. Pain shot through her ribs, but she maintained her seat, grimly urging the animal onward. After what seemed like hours, they reached the plateau Joe had mentioned. As Violet had hoped, it offered some shelter from the worst of the wind, with scattered pine trees providing minimal cover. The rain continued to fall, but less violently than in the canyon below. "We'll make camp here," she decided, dismounting carefully to hide her discomfort. No point trying to push further in this weather. They worked quickly to establish a crude camp, securing the horses and setting up a makeshift shelter with canvas from the pack horse. Getting a fire started in the rain proved nearly impossible until Preston discovered a fallen log with dry underside they could use for kindling. As the small flames finally caught, Violet couldn't suppress a wince as she knelt beside the fire. "You're hurt," Preston observed immediately, his eyes sharp despite his own exhaustion. It's nothing, she dismissed. Just got thrown against the saddle horn when my horse stumbled. He frowned. Let Joe check the herd, you need to rest. I'm fine, she insisted, but the pain in her side made her breath catch as she tried to stand. Preston moved to her side, supporting her elbow. Stubborn woman, he muttered, but there was concern rather than censure in his voice. At least sit down and dry off. Too tired to argue further, Violet allowed him to help her to a seat on a fallen log under their makeshift shelter. Joe had already gone to check the cattle, disappearing into the rain with a worried glance back at them. How bad is it? Preston asked, crouching beside her. Bruised ribs, I think, she admitted reluctantly. Nothing broken. He nodded, relief evident in his expression. Still, you should bind them, it will help with the pain. When she hesitated, he added gently, I can turn my back if you prefer, but it needs tending. The practical suggestion, offered with simple respect, decided her. I have bandages in my saddlebag, and yes, I would appreciate privacy. Preston retrieved the bandages and then moved to tend the fire, his back deliberately turned. Violet carefully loosened her clothing enough to wrap the bandages tightly around her ribcage, biting her lip against the pain. When she finished, she felt immediately better, the support easing the worst of the discomfort. Thank you, she said, adjusting her clothing. I'm decent now. He returned, offering her a cup of coffee he'd somehow managed to prepare. It's not much, but it's hot. The simple kindness touched her unexpectedly. In her determination to prove herself capable of running the ranch alone, Violet had grown unaccustomed to being cared for. She accepted the cup gratefully, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. The cattle, she asked. Joe's checking, but they seemed to settle once we reached level ground. Preston sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. The storm's moving east, should clear by morning. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the pattering of rain on the canvas above them, and the occasional distant lowing of cattle. I never thanked you, Violet said suddenly. Preston looked at her questioningly. For suggesting this drive, for helping make it possible. She met his eyes directly. Many men would have taken one look at a woman running a ranch alone and ridden on. He shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. You'd have figured something out. You're not the type to give up easily. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but it would have been much harder alone. She studied his profile in the firelight. You're not what I expected, Preston Galloway. What did you expect? When you rode up to the ranch, I thought you'd be like other drifters, looking for easy work, quick pay, and then gone. She shook her head slightly. But you're different. You notice things, you care about fairness. You speak like an educated man but work like someone born to the saddle. Her assessment unsettled him. She could see it in the slight tension that entered his shoulders. Don't make me out to be better than I am, he said quietly. I've spent 8 years drifting, avoiding attachments, leaving when things got complicated. Why? The question slipped out before she could reconsider. Preston stared into the fire for a long moment. Because it's safer, he finally said. Caring about people, places, it gives the world something to take from you, and the world is very good at taking. The raw honesty in his voice resonated with something in Violet. She understood loss, the temptation to protect oneself by withdrawing. After her mother died, she had watched her father struggle with that same impulse, to close himself off, to avoid the risk of further pain. My father used to say that a life without risk isn't much of a life at all, she said softly, that the things most worth having are the ones that require courage to pursue. Your father sounds wiser than me, Preston said with a slight smile. He would have liked you, Violet replied, surprised to realize how certain she was of this. He valued honesty and hard work above all else. Before Preston could respond, Joe returned, water streaming from his slicker. Cattle are settled, he reported, but this rain ain't letting up anytime soon. How are you feeling, Miss Violet? Better, she assured him, grateful for the bandages supporting her ribs. Just tired. We all are, Joe said, dropping heavily onto a log. Been a long day. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, none of them having the energy for proper cooking. As they ate, they discussed the route ahead, agreeing to adjust their path to avoid the flooded valley below. We'll lose half a day, Preston estimated, but better that than risking the herd in high water. After the meal, they arranged watches, with Joe taking first shift despite Violet's offer to start. "No offense, Miss Violet," the old foreman said firmly, "but you need rest more than either of us right now. Those ribs won't heal if you don't give them a chance." Too exhausted to argue, Violet settled into her bedroll under the shelter. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her as she listened to the rain and thought about her conversation with Preston. His words about avoiding attachments had struck a chord. Wasn't she doing something similar by refusing the marriage proposals that would have made her life easier, choosing independence over connection because it seemed safer? Through half-closed eyes, she watched Preston add wood to the fire, his movements efficient and graceful despite his exhaustion. There was something compelling about him, not just his handsome features, but the quiet competence with which he approached every task, the thoughtfulness behind his words. For the first time since her father's death, Violet found herself wondering what it might be like to share the burden of the ranch, not with someone who would take it from her, but with a true partner who understood its value and respected her place in it. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. As sleep finally claimed her, Violet's last conscious awareness was of Preston's silhouette against the firelight, a steady presence keeping watch through the storm. The storm passed during the night, leaving a world washed clean and sparkling in the morning sun. Despite the delay and Violet's injured ribs, they made good progress on the third day, pushing the cattle steadily northward along the revised route. Preston found himself watching Violet with increasing admiration. Despite obvious discomfort, she rode with determination, never complaining or seeking special accommodation. Her knowledge of the territory proved invaluable as they navigated around the flooded valley, finding passage through terrain that might have stymied less experienced guides. By the fourth day, they had reached the halfway point to Helena, camping beside a small lake where the cattle could drink their fill. The weather held clear but cold, with frost forming each morning on their bedrolls. "We've made up most of the time we lost," Joe announced with satisfaction as they sat around the fire that evening. "Should reach Helena on schedule if all goes well." "If all goes well," Violet repeated with a wry smile. "That's a big assumption on a cattle drive." "Always is," Preston agreed, "but we've handled the worst of the terrain. From here, it's mostly open country to Helena." Joe yawned hugely. "Well, I'm turning in. My bones are telling me it's going to be another cold night." After the foreman had settled into his bedroll, Violet and Preston remained by the fire. Over the past days, they had fallen into a comfortable pattern of sharing the evening watch, talking quietly while the others slept. "How are your ribs?" Preston asked, noting how she shifted carefully to ease her position. "Healing," she replied. "The binding helps." She glanced at him with a hint of mischief in her eyes. "I'm tougher than I look, you know." "I never doubted that," he said seriously. "You're one of the strongest people I've met, man or woman." The compliment brought a flush to her cheeks, visible, even in the firelight. "My mother used to worry that my father was raising me to be too independent," she confessed. She feared no man would want a wife who could rope cattle and break horses. "Some men are threatened by capable women," Preston acknowledged. "But others would value a partner they could respect as an equal." Their eyes met across the fire, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of possibilities neither had acknowledged before. Violet looked away first, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on her knee. "You never finished telling me about your life after you lost your ranch," she said, changing the subject. "Where did you go when you left Texas?" Preston accepted the diversion, though part of him wanted to pursue the momentary connection they'd shared. "North, initially, worked cattle drives up the Kishom Trail. Then west to Colorado for a time, mining camps, ranch work, whatever paid. Never staying anywhere long," she observed. "Never finding a reason to," he corrected gently. The implication hung between them, unspoken but palpable. Violet stared into the fire, her expression thoughtful. "What will you do after we reach Helena?" she asked finally. "After the cattle are sold." It was a question Preston had been asking himself with increasing frequency. The logical answer, the one that matched his pattern of the past 8 years, would be to take his wages and move on, perhaps to Oregon or Washington Territory. There was always work for a skilled cowhand, always new country to see. Yet the thought of riding away from Raven Creek Ranch, from Violet, created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. Over the past days, something had changed. The carefully maintained distance he kept from others had begun to crumble in the face of campfire conversations and shared challenges. "I haven't decided," he answered truthfully. "What about you?" "Once you've paid the bank, what's next for Raven Creek?" "Expansion, hopefully," she said, eyes brightening with plans long considered. "The north pasture could support twice the cattle we currently run. And I've thought about breeding horses as well. My father always said our valley had the perfect conditions for raising quality stock." Her enthusiasm was contagious, the vision of the ranch's future so vivid Preston could almost see it himself: expanded pastures, new stock, the buildings repaired and improved. "You really love that land, don't you?" he asked softly. "It's more than land," she replied, meeting his gaze. "It's home, it's belonging." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I know that must sound foolish to someone who's chosen to keep moving." "Not foolish," Preston assured her. "Just different from the path I've followed." "And is that path set in stone?" Violet's question was gentle but direct, her eyes searching his. Before Preston could answer, a distant sound caught his attention: hoofbeats approaching their camp. He rose immediately, hand moving to the rifle beside him. "Someone's coming," he warned quietly. "Wake Joe." While Violet roused the foreman, Preston moved to the edge of the firelight, positioning himself between the approaching riders and the camp. Through the darkness, he could make out 3 mounted figures moving steadily toward them. Joe joined him, shotgun in hand. "Might be nothing," the older man murmured. "Could be other travelers." "Could be," Preston agreed, though his instincts suggested otherwise. Few honest men traveled these remote trails after dark. The riders slowed as they approached the circle of firelight. Preston could now see they were rough-looking men, trail-worn and heavily armed. "Evening folks," called the leader, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard. "Saw your fire, hope you don't mind company." "You're welcome to share our fire," Violet replied, stepping forward despite Preston's warning glance. "But we're turning in soon, long day tomorrow." The 3 men exchanged looks that raised Preston's suspicions further. There was calculation in their eyes, an assessment of the small camp and its defenders. "Cattle drive?" asked the bearded man, nodding toward the herd visible in the moonlight beyond camp. "Heading to Helena," Joe answered cautiously. "Long way to go with just 3 hands," observed one of the other men, a thin figure with a scar running down one cheek. "We manage," Preston said evenly, noting how the third man was slowly edging his horse to the side, as if to flank them. The leader dismounted, his movements deliberately casual. "Name's Riker. These are my associates, Jennings and Cole. We've been prospecting up north. Thought we'd head to Helena ourselves for supplies." Preston doubted the men had done an honest day's prospecting in their lives. Their eyes were too shifty, their hands too close to their weapons, but confrontation would be dangerous with Violet present and the cattle vulnerable. "Coffee's still hot," he offered, keeping his tone neutral. "You're welcome to some before you continue your journey." The implied suggestion that they should move on wasn't lost on Riker. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Mighty kind, though we were thinking of camping here for the night." "Safer to travel together, don't you think? These hills can be dangerous." "Yes," Preston agreed, meeting the man's gaze steadily. "They can be." The tension in the air was palpable as Riker assessed Preston's calm stance and unwavering stare. After a moment, the bearded man shrugged. "But you're right, we should make more miles before camping. That coffee would be welcome, though." They passed an uneasy half-hour as the strangers drank coffee and asked questions that seemed innocent, but revealed too much interest in their route and the size of the herd. Violet maintained a composed presence, though Preston could sense her alertness in the way she positioned herself near the rifle leaning against a log. Finally, the 3 men mounted up, Riker tipping his hat to Violet with exaggerated courtesy. "Thanks for the hospitality, ma'am. Perhaps we'll see you on the trail ahead." "Safe travels," she replied evenly. They waited in silence until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did Joe exhale heavily. "Trouble," he pronounced. "Those weren't prospectors." "No," Preston agreed grimly. "They're scouts, probably have friends nearby." "Rustlers?" Violet asked, her face pale but composed. Preston nodded. "Or worse." "They'll be back, likely with more men." "What do we do?" Joe looked between them. "We're still 2 days from Helena." "Change our route," Preston decided. "They'll expect us to continue north along this valley. We'll head northeast at dawn, through the ridge country." That's rough terrain, Violet pointed out. We'll lose time. Better than losing the herd, Preston countered, or worse. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the night air. Rustlers in this territory were known for leaving no witnesses. We should take turns keeping watch, Violet said, all night. I'll take first watch, Preston volunteered. Then Joe, Violet, you'll take dawn watch when we're most vulnerable. She nodded, accepting the logic of his plan. As Joe returned to his bedroll to catch what sleep he could before his shift, Violet lingered beside Preston. Those men, she said quietly, they weren't just interested in the cattle, were they? Preston met her eyes, unwilling to lie. No. Men like that, they see a woman on the trail as another kind of opportunity. A flicker of fear crossed her face, quickly replaced by determination. Then it's fortunate I have you and Joe with me. We won't let anything happen to you, he promised, his voice low and fierce. Or to the herd. She touched his arm briefly, the contact sending warmth through him despite the night's chill. I know, she said simply, then moved to her bedroll. Preston watched her go, a protective instinct rising in him stronger than any he'd felt before. The thought of Riker and his men threatening Violet filled him with cold rage. For the first time in years he had someone, he was unwilling to lose, unwilling to leave behind. The realization should have frightened him, contradicting as it did his long-held belief that attachments were dangerous. Instead, it settled in his chest with the weight of certainty, as natural and inevitable as the dawn that would soon follow this tense night. As he kept watch, rifle across his knees, Preston accepted what he'd been fighting since he first rode into Raven Creek Ranch. Violet Harrington had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead, the capacity to care, to put down roots, to fight for something beyond his own survival. Whether she would want him to stay once the cattle drive ended remained uncertain. But one thing was clear as Preston gazed out into the darkness, alert for any sign of danger. If Riker and his men returned, they would discover that Preston Galloway was no longer a man with nothing to lose. At first light they broke camp quickly, driving the cattle northeast as planned. The terrain became increasingly difficult as they moved into the ridge country, steep inclines, narrow passages between rock formations, sparse grazing for the increasingly restless herd. Violet rode point again, her knowledge of the territory proving invaluable as she found passes that wouldn't appear on any map. Despite her injured ribs, she maintained a grueling pace, aware that speed might be their best defense against the threat that followed. By midday, Preston's concern had deepened. Twice he'd spotted dust on their back trail, riders keeping pace but maintaining distance, tracking their movement. They're still following, he reported during a brief rest to water the cattle at a small stream. 4 riders now, maybe 5. Joe squinted toward the horizon. Why haven't they made a move? They outnumber us. They're waiting for the right moment, Preston said grimly. Probably tonight when we're camped and the cattle are settled. Or they're hurting us, Violet suggested, surprising both men with her tactical insight, driving us into more difficult country, away from settlements or other travelers. Preston nodded, impressed by her assessment. That's possible. Either way, we need a defensive position for tonight. Violet consulted her father's journal. There's an old trapper's cabin about 6 miles ahead near Hawk Ridge, stone walls, good sight lines. We could reach it by nightfall. Perfect, Preston agreed. If we can get the cattle into the meadow below the ridge, we can defend the approach from the cabin. They pushed on, the terrain growing more challenging with each mile. Twice cattle slipped on steep descents, requiring quick action to prevent injuries. The constant vigilance, combined with the threat of pursuit, wore on all of them. By late afternoon, storm clouds had gathered again, and the temperature dropped sharply. When they finally spotted the old cabin perched on Hawk Ridge, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. Winter's coming early, Joe observed, looking skyward with concern. This could be a real storm, not just a flurry. All the more reason to secure the cabin, Preston said. The stone walls will provide shelter if this turns into a blizzard. They worked quickly to move the cattle into the sheltered meadow below the ridge, then led their horses up the narrow trail to the cabin. The structure was small but solid, a single room with a stone fireplace, its roof mostly intact despite years of abandonment. While Joe tended the horses in a crude linta beside the cabin, Preston and Violet gathered firewood from the surrounding pine forest. The snow was falling more heavily now, accumulating on the ground and reducing visibility. This weather might work in our favor, Violet remarked as they carried armloads of wood toward the cabin. Riker and his men will have a hard time finding us in a snowstorm. True, Preston agreed, but it also means we're stuck here until it passes. He glanced at her, noting the careful way she moved to protect her injured ribs. How are you holding up? I'm fine, she answered automatically, then smiled at his skeptical expression. Sore but functional, don't worry about me. Too late for that, he replied softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the threat of rustlers and the discomfort of the cold faded away. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first night around the campfire. The moment broke when Joe called from the cabin doorway. Fire's going, bring that wood in before it gets soaked. Inside, the small cabin warmed quickly as the fire blazed in the hearth. Joe had swept decades of dust from the single room and laid out their bedrolls. The space was tight for 3 people, but compared to sleeping outside in the developing storm, it seemed luxurious. I'll take first watch, Joe volunteered. You two get some rest, been a long day. Wake me in 4 hours, Preston instructed, sooner if you see or hear anything unusual. As Joe settled by the single window, rifle across his knees, Preston and Violet arranged themselves near the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow against the cabin walls with increasing force. Do you think they'll try to attack in this weather? Violet asked quietly, her voice pitched low so as not to disturb Joe's vigilance. Preston considered the question. It would be foolish. They can't see the approach, and the noise of the storm would cover our movements, but men like Riker aren't always guided by good sense. Violet nodded, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Despite the fire, the cabin retained a bone-deep chill, the stone walls radiating cold. You're shivering, Preston observed, concern evident in his voice. Just the dampness from the snow, she dismissed, though her teeth chattered slightly. Without asking permission, Preston moved closer, spreading his blanket over both of them. The shared warmth was immediate and welcome, though Violet stiffened momentarily at the unexpected proximity. Better, he asked, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the shared covering. She nodded, gradually relaxing as warmth seeped back into her limbs. Thank you, she murmured, her eyes on the dancing flames. They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the storm rage outside and Joe's occasional movements by the window. The close quarters created an intimacy unlike their previous campfire conversations, a sense of shelter shared against the harshness beyond the cabin walls. If we get through this, Violet said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the wind, if we reach Helena and sell the cattle. Would you consider staying at Raven Creek, I mean? The question caught Preston off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Their growing connection had been evident to both of them, acknowledged in small glances and lingering conversations. As what? He asked carefully. Your foreman. She met his eyes directly, courage in her steady gaze. As whatever you want to be, Preston, partner if that suits you. The simple offer, complicated by all it implied, rendered him momentarily speechless. In it he heard not just an invitation to stay, but an acknowledgement that what had grown between them might be worth exploring, worth risking. You hardly know me, he finally managed, though his heart raced at the possibility she presented. I know enough, she replied with quiet certainty. I know you're honest, I know you work hard. I know you stand up for what's right, even when it doesn't benefit you directly. She hesitated, then added softly, and I know that when I'm with you, I don't feel alone for the first time since my father died. The raw honesty of her words reached something deep inside Preston, breaking through the last of his carefully constructed defenses. For 8 years he'd convinced himself that the frontier was no place for lasting connections, that everyone was better off keeping to themselves. Violet's perspective, her belief in building something enduring, in finding strength through connection rather than isolation, challenged everything he thought he knew. I'd like that, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, staying at Raven Creek with you. Her smile in that moment, warm and genuine despite their precarious situation, made Preston feel as though something long missing had finally clicked into place. Before he could say more, express the depth of what her offer meant to him, Joe's urgent whisper interrupted. Someone's coming, 3 riders approaching from the south. All warmth vanished as they moved instantly to defensive positions. Preston doused the fire while Violet grabbed her rifle, taking position at the second window. Joe remained at his post, squinting through the driving snow. "Can you see who it is?" Preston asked, joining him. "Can't make out faces in this weather," Joe replied. "But they're moving purposeful, like they know we're here." "How would they find us in this storm?" Violet wondered, her earlier contentment replaced by focused vigilance. "Might have followed our trail before the snow covered it," Preston suggested. "Or they could know about this cabin, same as your father did." They watched tensely as the riders approached the base of the ridge, then dismounted. After a brief consultation, two remained with the horses while the third began to ascend the path toward the cabin. "Just one coming up," Joe reported, "others staying below." "Could be a trap," Preston warned. "Or they're waiting to see if we shoot first." The figure struggled up the snow-covered path, occasionally slipping on the steep incline. As he drew closer, the driving snow made identification difficult. "Hold your fire until we're certain," Preston instructed, though his own finger rested lightly on the trigger. "Could be a traveler seeking shelter." When the man was 30 yards from the cabin, he stopped, raising his arms to show he was unarmed. "Hello, the cabin," he called, his voice barely audible through the storm. "I'm not looking for trouble." Something about the voice seemed familiar to Preston. He strained to see through the swirling snow. "Identify yourself," he called back. "Name's Jenkins, from Silver Bend. I'm looking for Violet Harrington." Violet gasped beside him. "The banker, what's he doing here?" Preston's suspicions immediately heightened. "Could be a trick," he warned. "Riker might have learned your name, using it to get us to open the door." "Only one way to find out," Violet decided. She moved to the door, calling through it, "What business do you have with me, Mr. Jenkins?" "Last I checked, our loan payment wasn't due for another 2 weeks." There was a pause then. "I'm not here about the loan, Miss Harrington. I'm here with a warning. May I approach?" Preston positioned himself beside the door, rifle ready. "If this is a trap," he said quietly to Violet, "I'll handle it. Stay behind me." She nodded, though he could see she had no intention of hiding if trouble started. Together, they opened the cabin door just enough to see the figure still standing in the snow with raised hands. It was indeed Frank Jenkins, the banker from Silver Bend, his usually immaculate appearance now disheveled from the journey and weather. His face was red with cold, snow accumulating on his hat and shoulders. "Miss Harrington," he said with evident relief, "thank God I found you." "What are you doing here, mister?" "Jenkins," Violet demanded, suspicion evident in her voice. "May I come in? It's freezing out here, and what I have to tell you shouldn't be shouted across the ridge." Preston and Violet exchanged glances. After a moment she nodded slightly. Preston opened the door wider, though he kept his rifle visible. "Come in," he said, slowly, "and your companions stay where they are." Jenkins hurried into the cabin, stomping snow from his boots and moving gratefully toward the rekindled fire. "Those aren't companions," he corrected, warming his hands. "They're my escort, Sheriff Miller and his deputy. I insisted on continuing when they wanted to make camp before the storm hit." "Sheriff Miller?" Joe asked incredulously. "From Silver Bend. What in tarnation is he doing out here?" Jenkins turned to face them, his expression grave. "Looking for Riker and his gang, and warning you, Miss Harrington." "Warning me about what?" Violet asked, still keeping a cautious distance. "Pearson," Jenkins said simply. "He hired Riker and his men to ensure your cattle never reach Helena." He looked uncomfortable, avoiding her eyes, "and to ensure you wouldn't return to make trouble for him in the future." The blunt statement of deadly intent sent a chill through the cabin that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "How do you know this?" Preston demanded, his grip tightening on his rifle. Jenkins sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "Because initially I was part of it, Pearson and I. We've been working together to acquire distressed properties in the valley. Your ranch was next on the list." Violet's face hardened with anger. "You deliberately called in our loan early, knowing we couldn't pay." "Yes," Jenkins admitted, his face flushing with shame rather than cold now. "I'm not proud of it, but when Pearson suggested hiring Riker to ensure you wouldn't reach Helena with your cattle," he shook his head. "That was too far. I won't have blood on my hands, especially not a woman's." "So you rode out in a snowstorm to warn us?" Preston asked skeptically. "After trying to steal her ranch." "Business is one thing," Jenkins replied stiffly. "Murder is quite another. When I learned what Pearson intended, I went to Sheriff Miller. He was preparing a posse anyway. Riker's gang robbed the stage from Helena 3 days ago. He looked directly at Violet. I'm not asking forgiveness, Miss Harrington. But I am trying to make it right. Violet studied the banker with a mixture of anger and grudging respect for his current honesty. How many men does Riker have? At least 6 that we know of, Jenkins replied, all dangerous. They know these mountains well. And they're still following us, Preston added grimly. We spotted riders on our trail today. Jenkins nodded. The sheriff hoped to intercept them before they found you, but this storm has complicated matters. We need to get word to Miller, Joe suggested. Let him know we've spotted Riker's men nearby. I'll go, Jenkins volunteered. My men are waiting at the base of the ridge. Preston shook his head. Too dangerous in this weather. And if Riker's watching the cabin, you'd lead them straight to the sheriff. He considered their options. We'll wait out the storm here. The sheriff will either find us or find Riker's gang. Either way, we're better defended in the cabin than on the open trail. As if to emphasize his point, the wind howled more fiercely outside, rattling the cabin's single window. The storm had developed into a full blizzard, visibility reduced to mere feet beyond the walls. At least the cattle are sheltered in the valley below, Violet observed, practical even in crisis. And the snow will make it harder for Riker to move against us tonight. They settled in to wait out the storm, tension evident in every movement. Jenkins accepted a cup of coffee with murmured thanks, keeping his distance from Violet, clearly aware of her justified anger. Preston positioned himself by the window, watching the swirling snow for any sign of movement. Behind him, he could hear Joe quietly explaining their situation to the banker, the cattle drive to Helena, their change of route after encountering Riker's scouts. Violet joined Preston at the window, her presence a comfort despite the danger surrounding them. Do you think the sheriff will find us? She asked softly. If the storm breaks by morning, yes, Preston replied. Miller knows these mountains too, from what Jenkins says. She nodded, her shoulder brushing against his as they both peered into the whiteness beyond the glass. I meant what I said earlier, she said quietly, about you staying at Raven Creek. That hasn't changed because of this. Preston turned to look at her, struck by her certainty even amid crisis. Assuming we survive Riker and his gang, he said, attempting humor. We will, she said with surprising conviction. I refuse to lose the ranch to Pearson's schemes. And I refuse to lose you when I've just found you. The simple declaration, spoken without artifice or calculation, moved Preston deeply. In that moment, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, he made a decision that contradicted 8 years of careful detachment. When this is over, he said, his voice low and intense, I'm staying, not as your foreman or hired hand, as your partner in every sense of the word, if that's what you want. Violet's eyes widened, understanding the full implication of his words. Then she smiled, a smile that seemed to illuminate the dim cabin. It is, she whispered, it's exactly what I want. Before either could say more, a sudden noise outside the cabin snapped their attention back to the storm-lashed night. Someone or something was moving in the darkness beyond their shelter. The sound came again, a scraping against the cabin's outer wall, too deliberate to be caused by wind alone. Everyone inside froze, listening intently. Jenkins instinctively moved away from the window, while Joe raised his shotgun, eyes narrowed. Could be a branch, Violet whispered hopefully. Preston shook his head slightly. No trees close enough to the wall. He motioned for silence, moving carefully toward the door. The cabin had been built with defense in mind, thick logs for walls, the single window positioned for observation rather than entry. Anyone attempting to break in would have to come through the door. Another noise, this time at the corner of the structure. Footsteps, muffled by snow but unmistakable. They're trying to surround us, Preston murmured. Using the storm for cover. How many do you think? Joe asked, his weathered face grim. Can't tell, sound carries strangely in a blizzard. Preston made a quick decision. Joe, cover the window. Violet, the back corner. Jenkins, stay low. The banker nodded nervously, crouching beside the fireplace. Despite his earlier bravery in bringing the warning, he was clearly unaccustomed to violence. Preston positioned himself beside the door, listening intently. For several minutes, the only sounds were the howling wind and the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers. Then, just as they began to relax, a voice called out from the darkness. "We know you're in there, Harrington. Come out and talk, or we start shooting." Riker's rough voice was unmistakable, carrying despite the storm. Preston and Violet exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "What do you want, Riker?" Violet called back, her voice steady despite the danger. "Just business, ma'am," came the reply, almost conversational. "We've been hired to ensure your cattle don't reach Helena." "Nothing personal." "Murdering a woman seems pretty personal to me," Preston responded, his tone hard. A laugh floated through the darkness. "Ah, the Texas drifter, still playing protector." "Pearson didn't mention you, but we can accommodate another grave." "There's a sheriff and his deputy at the bottom of this ridge," Preston warned. "Whatever Pearson's paying you won't matter when you're hanging from a gallows in Helena." A pause, then. "You're bluffing. No law would be out in this storm." Jenkins moved forward, surprising everyone. "He's not bluffing, Riker," the banker called. "Sheriff Miller is here with his deputy." "I brought them myself." Another longer silence followed this revelation. Preston could almost feel Riker recalculating, weighing options. "Jenkins," the outlaw sounded genuinely surprised. "What the hell are you doing there?" "Pearson said you were handling the bank side of things." "Plans change," Jenkins replied, "especially when they involve murder." "Turn around and ride away, Riker," Preston added. "The storm will cover your tracks. You can be miles from here by dawn." For a moment it seemed the outlaws might actually consider the offer. Then a new voice spoke from a different position outside, the scarred man they'd seen with Riker at the campfire. "Boss, they're lying about the sheriff. I checked the base of the ridge before following you up. No one's there. Must have gotten lost in the storm." Preston's heart sank. Miller and his deputy had indeed lost their way, leaving Jenkins warning their only advantage, one now neutralized. Riker's voice hardened. "Thanks for confirming that, banker. Now we know exactly how things stand." To the cabin occupants he called, "Here's my offer. Send out the woman and the cattle, and the rest of you can ride away. Otherwise we burn you out." "You can't burn a stone cabin in a blizzard," Joe scoffed. "Maybe not," Riker agreed, "but we can wait you out. No food, no water, trapped like rats while we pick off your cattle one by one below." It was a standoff, with time on Riker's side. Even if the storm cleared by morning, they had limited supplies and no way to protect the herd from the safety of the cabin. Eventually, they would have to emerge. Violet moved to Preston's side, her expression resolute. "I have an idea," she whispered, "but it's risky." "At this point I'm open to anything," he replied quietly. "The back wall of the cabin," she explained. "My father's notes mentioned a narrow ravine behind it, leading down to the valley. It's steep but passable on foot, if someone could get down to where the sheriff was last seen." Preston immediately grasped her plan. "Create a diversion here while someone slips out the back to find Miller." He nodded slowly. "It could work." "I'll go," Violet volunteered. "I know these mountains better than any of you." "Absolutely not," Preston replied firmly. "Riker wants you specifically. I'll go." Joe joined their hushed conference. "Neither of you should go." "I'm the expendable one here." "No one is expendable," Violet insisted. "And you can barely walk after a full day riding, Joe. Your leg won't handle a steep descent in a blizzard." "She's right," Preston acknowledged reluctantly. "It needs to be me." Outside, Riker was growing impatient. "What's your answer, Harrington? We're freezing out here waiting." "Give us time to discuss your generous offer," Preston called back sarcastically. "It's not every day someone proposes to murder us." A bullet splintered the wood beside the window in response, causing Jenkins to flatten himself against the floor. "That was a warning," Riker shouted. "Next one comes through the window." While Joe returned fire to keep the outlaws at bay, Preston and Violet moved to the back wall of the cabin. Behind a stack of firewood, Violet located what her father's notes had described, a small, crudely constructed door, more a hatch than a proper exit, built into the stone foundation. "It was an escape route," she explained, working to clear debris that had accumulated over decades, in case of Indian attacks. Together they managed to open the hatch, revealing a dark, narrow space beyond. Cold air rushed in, along with swirling snow. Preston peered into the darkness, barely making out a steep, rocky slope descending from the back of the cabin. I can't let you do this, Violet said, gripping his arm as he prepared to leave. It's too dangerous. More dangerous to stay here until Riker decides to rush the cabin, Preston countered. He checked his pistol and tucked extra ammunition into his coat. I'll find the sheriff and bring help. What if you can't find them? What if they've sought shelter elsewhere? Then I'll create a diversion from below, he promised. Draw Riker's men away from the cabin somehow. Violet's eyes shone with emotion in the dim light. Preston, she said softly, I can't lose you now, not when we've just found each other. The simple honesty of her words touched him deeply. In response, Preston did what he'd been wanting to do since their first campfire conversation. He drew her gently to him and kissed her. It was brief but profound, a promise between them that transcended the danger of their situation. You won't lose me, he whispered as they parted. I have too much to come back for. With a final look at her face, memorizing every detail, Preston slipped through the hatch into the howling storm beyond. The descent was every bit as treacherous as he'd feared, a near-vertical ravine made slick with snow and ice. He moved carefully, using exposed roots and rocks as handholds, fighting against the wind that threatened to tear him from the mountainside. The journey seemed endless, the darkness and swirling snow disorienting. Several times he nearly lost his footing, catching himself at the last moment. His hands grew numb with cold, his face stinging from the driving snow. Yet the thought of Violet waiting in the cabin, of Joe and even Jenkins depending on him, drove Preston onward. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, he reached the base of the ridge. The valley stretched before him, a white expanse in the storm. The cattle were huddled together in the sheltered meadow, dark shapes barely visible through the falling snow. Preston paused, trying to orient himself. Jenkins had said the sheriff and his deputy were waiting at the base of the ridge, but the storm could have driven them to seek better shelter. Where would they have gone? As he stood considering his options, a faint light caught his eye to the east, a campfire, partially sheltered by an outcropping of rock. Moving cautiously toward it, Preston kept his hand on his pistol. It could be Sheriff Miller and his deputy, or it could be more of Riker's gang. As he approached, he could make out two figures huddled near the small fire, their horses tethered nearby. The men were focused on maintaining their modest blaze against the storm, and didn't notice Preston's approach until he was almost upon them. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his gun drawn but held low. "Would one of you happen to be Sheriff Miller?" Both men leapt to their feet, hands moving to their weapons, then freezing as they registered Preston's ready pistol. "I'm Miller," said the older of the two, a stocky man with a silver-streaked beard. "Who's asking?" "Preston Galloway. I'm with Violet Harrington at the cabin up on Hawk Ridge. We've got a situation with Riker's gang." The sheriff's posture relaxed slightly, though his companion, presumably the deputy, remained tense. "Jenkins found you, then?" "He did," Preston confirmed. "Unfortunately, so did Riker. They've got the cabin surrounded, 4 or 5 men at least." Miller cursed quietly. "We got separated from Jenkins in the storm. Been waiting it out here, hoping to continue the search at first light." He studied Preston with newfound respect. "You came down that ridge in this blizzard." "Didn't have much choice," Preston replied grimly. "Riker's threatening to wait us out or burn us out, whichever comes first." The sheriff exchanged glances with his deputy, a silent communication born of long partnership. "How many in the cabin besides you?" "Violet Harrington, her foreman Joe, and Jenkins. All armed, but Riker has us outnumbered and surrounded." Miller nodded, decision made. "Thompson," he said to his deputy, "gather your gear. We're heading up." As the younger man hurried to comply, Miller turned back to Preston. "Any ideas on how to approach without walking into an ambush?" Preston quickly outlined his thoughts. The ravine he'd descended offered a way back to the cabin unseen, while a frontal approach from the trail might draw Riker's attention, creating an opportunity to flank them. Risky, the sheriff acknowledged, but better than letting them dictate terms. He checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Lead on, Galloway. Let's see if we can surprise Mr. Riker for a change." The ascent proved even more challenging than the descent had been, the 3 men fighting against gravity, wind, and treacherous footing. Several times they had to pause to help each other over particularly difficult sections. By the time they neared the top, all 3 were exhausted, their breath coming in harsh gasps visible in the cold air. Preston halted them just below the ridge line. Riker's men were surrounding the cabin, he whispered, at least 2 at the front, others at the sides. Miller nodded. Thompson and I will create a distraction from the trail. You get back inside through that hatch and prepare to support from within. When you hear us engage, be ready. It was a simple plan with significant risks, but none of them could devise a better alternative. They separated, Preston continuing his climb toward the back of the cabin, while the lawman circled around toward the main trail. As he neared the hidden door, Preston could hear voices, Riker still calling demands, Violet's occasional responses keeping the outlaws engaged. Good, he thought, they don't know I've left. The element of surprise remained intact. Reaching the hatch, he tapped softly, hoping the sound would carry to those inside without alerting those surrounding the structure. After a tense moment, the door cracked open, and Violet's relieved face appeared. Thank God, she whispered, helping him climb through. I was beginning to think. I found the sheriff, Preston interrupted, shaking snow from his coat. He and his deputy are circling around to approach from the trail. When they engage, we need to be ready to support them. Joe and Jenkins joined them, the banker looking pale but determined, Joe grimly checking his shotgun. How many men did you spot out there? Joe asked. For that I could see, Preston replied. But there could be more in positions I couldn't observe. Violet touched his frozen hands, rubbing them between her own to restore circulation. What's the plan? Preston quickly explained the coordinated attack they'd arranged with Sheriff Miller. When we hear his signal, Joe and I will cover the front. Violet, you watch the side window. Jenkins. I can handle a gun, the banker interrupted, surprising them all. I was in the state militia before becoming a banker. Preston nodded, adjusting his strategy. Then you take the rear, in case they try to circle around. They moved to their positions, the tension in the cabin palpable as they waited for Miller's signal. Minutes stretched endlessly, the only sounds the howling wind and Riker's occasional taunts from outside. Then suddenly a commanding voice cut through the storm. This is Sheriff Miller. Throw down your weapons and surrender. The sheriff's announcement was followed immediately by gunfire, sharp cracks that echoed across the ridge. Preston and Joe moved to the front window, firing at the shadows they could see scrambling for cover. The battle erupted in chaotic intensity, muzzle flashes illuminating the snowy darkness, bullets splintering wood and thudding into stone. Riker's men, caught by surprise between the cabin and the approaching lawman, returned fire frantically. I see 2 by the large pine, Violet called, firing carefully through the side window. Her shot was rewarded with a cry of pain. Preston and Joe maintained steady fire at the front, forcing the outlaws there to keep their heads down. Jenkins at the rear reported no movement, suggesting Riker hadn't positioned men behind the cabin. The firefight continued for several minutes, neither side gaining a clear advantage. Then a bullet shattered the window beside Joe, sending glass fragments flying. The old foreman cried out, dropping to one knee as blood spread across his upper arm. Joe. Violet moved toward him, but he waved her back. Stay at your post, he ordered through gritted teeth. It's just a graze. Outside, a new voice rose above the gunfire, Riker, calling to his scattered men. Fall back to the horses. We're outnumbered. They're retreating, Preston observed, peering cautiously through the damaged window. He could make out dark figures moving down the ridge, away from the cabin. Sheriff Miller's voice confirmed it. Galloway, Miss Harrington, they're running. Thompson and I are in pursuit. Preston unbarred the door, opening it cautiously. The storm had begun to abate, the snow falling less heavily now. In the improved visibility, he could see Miller and his deputy advancing toward the cabin, rifles ready. Are you all right in there? The sheriff called. Joe's been hit, but not seriously, Preston replied. The rest of us are unharmed. Miller nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. We got one of them, Jennings, I think. The others are heading down the ridge. Thompson and I will follow their trail while it's fresh. I'm coming with you, Preston decided, grabbing his coat. He turned to Violet. Stay here with Joe and Jenkins. Bolt the door behind me. She caught his arm. Be careful, she said, her eyes conveying more than words could. Always, he promised, touching her cheek briefly before joining the lawman outside. The 3 men descended the ridge quickly, following the clear tracks left by the fleeing outlaws. The storm had diminished to occasional flurries, the clouds breaking to reveal a night sky studded with stars. The sudden clarity after hours of blinding snow seemed almost surreal. They found the outlaws' horses gone from where they'd been tethered, the tracks leading down into the valley where the cattle were still huddled together, undisturbed by the gunfire above. "They're heading west," Thompson observed, studying the trail, "probably making for the territorial border." Miller nodded in agreement. "With this fresh snow, we can track them clear to Idaho if needed." He turned to Preston. "You've done your part, Galloway. Best get back to the cabin and tend to your friend." Preston hesitated, torn between continuing the pursuit and returning to ensure Violet's safety. The decision was made for him when distant gunfire erupted from the direction of the cabin. "Go," Miller ordered, already turning with his deputy to continue following Riker's trail. "We'll handle these ones." Preston didn't need further urging. He ran back up the ridge, heart pounding with more than physical exertion. The gunfire had stopped by the time he neared the cabin, replaced by an ominous silence. Approaching cautiously, rifle ready, he called out, "Violet, Joe." The door opened slowly, revealing Jenkins, his face pale. "Galloway," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God." "What happened?" Preston demanded, pushing past him into the cabin. "I heard gunshots." The scene inside froze his blood. Joe sat propped against the wall, his wounded arm now properly bandaged. Beside him knelt Violet, pressing a cloth against his leg, where a fresh bloodstain spread across his trousers. On the floor near the door lay a body, Riker himself, face down in a spreading pool of blood. "He doubled back," Joe explained grimly. "Must have separated from the others. Came in shooting when Jenkins opened the door to check outside." Preston crossed to Violet's side, examining Joe's wound. "How bad?" "Through and through," the foreman replied stoically. "Hurts like hell, but I'll live." Violet looked up at Preston, her face smudged with Joe's blood but her eyes clear. "I shot him," she said simply, nodding toward Riker's body, "when he turned his gun toward Joe after wounding him." The matter-of-fact way she stated this, without hysteria or regret, reinforced Preston's growing understanding of her character. Violet Harrington was not just stubborn and intelligent, but possessed a core of steel that allowed her to do what was necessary when those she cared for were threatened. "You did what you had to," Preston assured her, touching her shoulder gently. "No one could have done differently." She nodded, returning to the task of binding Joe's leg wound. "Jenkins, bring more water," she instructed, "and Preston, there's whiskey in my saddlebag." "Joe could use it." As they worked together to tend Joe's injuries, Preston found himself watching Violet with growing admiration. Despite the trauma of killing a man, perhaps her first, she remained focused on practical necessities, her hands steady as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. It was nearly dawn by the time Sheriff Miller and his deputy returned, bringing news that the remaining outlaws had escaped across the valley, though Thompson had wounded another before they disappeared into the foothills. "They won't trouble you further," Miller assured them, accepting a cup of coffee with gratitude. "Riker was the leader. Without him, the gang will likely scatter." He glanced at Riker's body, now covered with a blanket. "You say Miss Harrington shot him?" "In defense of her foreman," Preston confirmed. "Riker came in shooting." Miller nodded, unsurprised. "Jenkins told me about her father. Said Jacob Harrington raised her to handle herself." He looked at Violet with respect. "He'd be proud, ma'am." As the night's tension gradually dissipated with the coming dawn, practical matters reasserted themselves. Joe needed proper medical attention, and the cattle still had to reach Helena if Raven Creek Ranch was to be saved. "I can take Joe back to Silver Bend in my wagon," Jenkins volunteered. "Doc Wilson can tend him there." The offer surprised them all, given the banker's earlier role in their troubles. He seemed to read their thoughts, for he added quietly, "It's the least I can do. And when you return from Helena, Miss Harrington, we'll discuss restructuring that loan on terms more favorable to you." His attempt at making amends was unexpected but welcome. Violet accepted with a gracious nod. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, that would be appreciated." With Joe unable to continue the drive, Sheriff Miller offered an alternative. "Thompson can ride with you to Helena," he suggested. "He knows the territory as well as anyone, and after last night, I'd feel better knowing you had an extra gun along." The arrangements were quickly settled. Miller and Jenkins would transport Joe and Riker's body back to Silver Bend, while Preston, Violet, and Deputy Thompson would continue to Helena with the cattle once the storm fully cleared. As the others made preparations for departure, Preston found a moment alone with Violet outside the cabin. The rising sun had broken through the clouds, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white and gold. "Are you really all right?" he asked softly, studying her face in the clear morning light. She considered the question honestly. "I will be," she replied. "I keep thinking I should feel more, something, regret perhaps, or horror. But he came to kill us, Preston. He would have killed Joe and you and me without hesitation." "That's the frontier," Preston said. "Sometimes terrible choices are forced upon us. The measure of a person is how they carry those choices afterward." Violet smiled slightly. More wisdom from the drifter who claims the frontier is no place for putting down roots. He acknowledged the gentle teasing with a smile of his own. "Perhaps I'm reconsidering that position." His expression grew serious again. "What you did took courage, not just shooting Riker but everything, this drive, standing up to Pearson, fighting for your ranch." "I had help," she reminded him, her eyes holding his. "I still do." The simple statement contained layers of meaning, acknowledgement of the past day's partnership, and affirmation of the future they'd begun to envision together. Preston took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You'll always have it," he promised, "as long as you want me at Raven Creek." "That might be a very long time," she warned, but her eyes were bright with something that looked remarkably like happiness despite the night's trauma. "I'm counting on it," Preston replied, and sealed the promise with a kiss as the sun rose fully over the snow-covered mountains, marking the beginning of a new day, and a new path forward neither of them had anticipated when a drifting cowboy rode up to a struggling ranch just 1 week earlier. Helena, Montana territory. 2 weeks later. The auction house erupted in applause as the final bid was accepted, marking the successful sale of the Raven Creek Ranch cattle at a price nearly double what Pearson had offered. Violet stood beside Preston, her face flushed with triumph as buyers came forward to congratulate her on the quality of her stock. "Your father raised fine cattle, Miss Harrington," observed a buyer from the Eastern Railroad. "I'd be interested in contracting with your ranch for future herds." "We'd welcome the opportunity," Violet replied confidently. "Raven Creek will be expanding our operation this coming year." As the crowd dispersed, Preston and Deputy Thompson joined her, both looking satisfied with the outcome of their journey. Despite delays from the storm and the confrontation with Riker's gang, they had delivered the herd to Helena on schedule, finding an eager market awaiting them. "Congratulations," Thompson said, tipping his hat to Violet. "Sheriff Miller will be pleased to hear the drive was completed successfully." "We couldn't have done it without your help," she acknowledged. "Please convey our thanks to the sheriff as well." "I'll ride with you back to Silver Bend," Thompson offered. "Sheriff's orders. He wants to ensure you return safely, especially with the proceeds of the sale." Preston nodded gratefully. "We'd welcome the company." "How's Joe recovering?" "Last telegram said he's doing well," Thompson reported. "Doc Wilson says he'll be back in the saddle by spring, though he'll have some impressive scars to show for his adventure." As they left the auction house, stepping into the brisk autumn air of Helena's Main Street, Violet slipped her arm through Preston's. The past 2 weeks had solidified what began during their journey, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared challenges, and growing affection. "We should celebrate," she suggested, smiling up at him. "Our first successful cattle drive deserves recognition." "Our first of many," Preston agreed, returning her smile with a warmth that still surprised him. The barriers he'd maintained for 8 years had fallen completely during their journey to Helena. In their place had grown something he'd once believed impossible on the frontier, a sense of belonging, of having found something worth staying for. That evening, they dined at Helena's finest restaurant, Deputy Thompson discreetly keeping watch from a nearby table. The proceeds from the cattle sale were securely deposited in the Helena Bank, with a draft to be transferred to Silver Bend for the loan payment. "To Raven Creek Ranch," Preston proposed, raising his glass. "And its remarkable owner." Violet clinked her glass against his. "To partnerships," she countered, "and new beginnings." As they discussed plans for the ranch's future, expanding the herd, improving the north pasture, possibly breeding horses as Violet had always dreamed, Preston marveled at the transformation in his own thinking. Just weeks ago, he had been convinced the frontier was no place for attachments, that survival meant remaining unencumbered by connections to people or places. Now he found himself eagerly planning improvements to a ranch he already thought of as home, with a woman who had challenged every assumption he'd made about frontier life. "What are you thinking?" Violet asked, noticing his momentary distraction. "About how much can change in such a short time," he admitted. "3 weeks ago, I was a drifter with no destination in mind." Now, now, she prompted when he hesitated. Preston reached across the table, taking her hand. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere but Raven Creek with you." The simple declaration brought a radiance to Violet's face that outshone the restaurant's chandeliers. "I was hoping you'd say that," she confessed, "because I've been thinking about something my father once told me." "What's that?" "He said that when I found a man worth keeping, I'd know because he'd see the ranch as I do, not as land to be owned, but as a legacy to be built upon." She squeezed his hand. "You see it that way, don't you?" "I do," Preston confirmed. "Your father built something remarkable, so have you, carrying on despite everything. I'd be honored to help continue that legacy." The conversation paused as their dinner arrived, but the connection between them remained unbroken, a tangible current of understanding and shared purpose that had grown stronger with each challenge they'd faced together. Later, as they walked back to their hotel through Helena's lamplit streets, Preston made a decision he'd been contemplating since their success at the auction. "Violet," he began, stopping beneath the awning of a closed shop. "There's something I need to ask you." She turned to face him, her expression curious. "What is it?" Preston took both her hands in his, suddenly nervous despite the certainty in his heart. "I know we've only known each other a short time, but the past weeks have shown me more about you, about us, than years of ordinary acquaintance could have." Violet's eyes widened as she began to understand the direction of his words. "I've spent 8 years believing the frontier was no place for lasting connections," Preston continued. "You've shown me how wrong I was. With you, I've found something I never thought to find again after losing my family's ranch, a sense of home, of purpose beyond mere survival." He drew a deep breath, then spoke the words he'd never imagined saying to anyone. "Violet Harrington, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of building Raven Creek's legacy together, as true partners in every sense?" For a moment she stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable in the shadowed light. Then, with a smile that seemed to illuminate the night, she threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she whispered against his ear. "Oh, Preston, yes." Their kiss, there on a Helena street with stars emerging in the autumn sky above, sealed a promise that had begun beside a campfire during a cattle drive born of necessity. When they finally parted, both were laughing with the simple joy of having found in each other what the frontier so often denied, a chance to build something lasting in a land of transience, to create a legacy stronger than the challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. Silver Bend, Montana territory. 1 month later. The small church was filled to capacity as Preston Galloway and Violet Harrington exchanged their vows before the assembled townspeople. The bride wore her mother's restored wedding dress, a simple gown of ivory satin that complemented her honey-blonde hair, now arranged in an elegant knot adorned with wildflowers. Joe, recovering well from his injuries, stood proudly as Preston's best man, while Mrs. Turner, the ranch's part-time housekeeper, served as Violet's matron of honor. Even Frank Jenkins attended, his presence a visible symbol of the reconciliation that had occurred following their return from Helena. The banker had been true to his word, restructuring Violet's loan on favorable terms and publicly severing his business relationship with Pearson. The cattle buyer himself had departed Silver Bend hastily after Sheriff Miller began investigating his connection to Riker's gang, leaving his business to be acquired by a more reputable merchant from Helena. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," declared the preacher, beaming at the couple before him. "You may kiss the bride." As Preston drew Violet into their first kiss as a married couple, the church erupted in cheers and applause. Young Billy Tucker, who had faithfully maintained the ranch during their absence, whistled loudly until Joe elbowed him into propriety. The celebration continued at Raven Creek Ranch, where tables had been set up in the yard and a fiddler played lively tunes for dancing. Lanterns hung from the porch and trees, creating a magical atmosphere as darkness fell. "Mrs. Galloway," Preston murmured as they shared a quiet moment away from the festivities. "I'm still getting used to how right that sounds." Violet leaned against him, contentment evident in every line of her body. "I think my father would approve," she said. "He always said the ranch needed a man who understood cattle and horses, though I suspect he meant as a foreman, not a son-in-law." Preston laughed, his arms tightening around her. "I hope I can live up to his expectations." "You already have," she assured him. "Raven Creek is thriving because of you, because of us. The new breeding stock arrives next week, the north pasture fence is complete, and Jenkins says our credit is good for that expansion we discussed." Indeed, the transformation of the ranch in just 1 month had been remarkable. With the proceeds from the cattle sale secured and their loan restructured, Preston and Violet had implemented improvements that Jacob Harrington had only dreamed of. The roof no longer leaked, the barn had been reinforced for winter, and plans were underway for a spring expansion that would nearly double their operation. More than the physical changes, however, was the shift in the ranch's standing within the community. What had once been viewed as a struggling enterprise run by a stubborn woman was now recognized as one of the territory's most promising operations, managed by a partnership that combined Violet's knowledge of the land with Preston's experience in cattle. As they rejoined the celebration, accepting congratulations and good wishes from friends and neighbors, Preston reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a drifting cowhand with no destination to a husband and rancher with roots and purpose, all because he'd stopped at a struggling ranch on a whim, offering help to a woman who refused to surrender her father's legacy. Later that night, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone in the ranch house that was now truly their shared home, Preston drew Violet close beside the fireplace. "I've been thinking about something," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She murmured, looking up at him with contentment in her eyes. "Remember when we first met, how you asked why I was helping you?" She nodded. "You said it was because you understood what it was like to lose something that mattered." "That was true," he acknowledged, "but I've realized there was more to it, something I couldn't admit then, maybe not even to myself." "What was that?" Violet asked, curiosity warming her voice. Preston smiled, the expression no longer rare but a frequent visitor to a face once guarded by years of careful detachment. "I think, from the moment I saw you standing up to Pearson in that saloon, something in me recognized something in you. A kindred spirit, perhaps, someone who understood that the frontier isn't just about survival, but about building something worthwhile." "And now," she prompted, her hands resting against his chest, "now I know that what I gained when I rode into Raven Creek Ranch was worth infinitely more than anything I might have lost by staying in one place." He kissed her gently. "You showed me that putting down roots isn't a risk to be avoided, but the greatest reward the frontier has to offer." Violet's smile illuminated her face, the happiness there reflecting his own. "For a man who claimed the West was no place for attachments, you've become quite the philosopher about belonging." "I had an excellent teacher," he replied, drawing her closer. "A stubborn, beautiful rancher who refused to give up on her home, or on a drifting cowboy who'd forgotten what home meant." Outside, snow began to fall gently on Raven Creek Ranch, the first of the winter that would test their preparations and planning. But inside, beside the crackling fire that symbolized the warmth and safety they'd created together, Preston and Violet Galloway faced the future with the certainty that came from having found in each other what the frontier so often denied: a partnership strong enough to weather any storm, and a love worth far more than any bet ever wagered in the wild, unforgiving West.